Marek, thanks very much for joining us.
Pleasure, Richard. Thank you.
Just give us some of the insights, I guess, in terms of the macro picture that you're seeing as we come into 2021.
It's going to be a very dynamic year because you have so many things going on at the strategic level which are going to affect Central Europe, and obviously the big thing out there is COVID and how the region responds to the vaccine programs. We're already seeing sort of some differentials in countries in relation to Poland, how quickly they're vaccinating. Hungary is trying to forge ahead with its own separate program of vaccinations outside of the EU managed system or additional to the EU managed system. So I think there's a bit of a race going on within Central Europe as to who gets out of lockdown first. And the real worry is that given the current semi-glacial pace of these vaccinations, actually nobody's really going to get out of lockdown. And we could be entering 2022 in a year's time with still substantial restrictions, obviously going to impact growth. The other vector that's going to be a big impact on the region is obviously the EU and Brussels. And part of that is, on the one hand, obviously the implementation of the COVID rescue package. That package in general for all EU member states is not perhaps what it could potentially be cracked up to be. It sounds like a lot of money, 750 billion euro, but only half of that roughly is actual grants. It's spread out over a long cycle until 2026, and there are all sorts of terms and conditions attached to it. There's no sign of a follow-on stimulus package coming, so that's going to be one issue. And obviously Poland and Hungary in particular out of Central Europe are a bit worried about the imposition onto the general EU multi-year financial framework cash transfers, the linkage that's being made within the Commission to rule of law issues. And there is a worry that there will be disruption if over the next few years there are cases brought to whether it's the European Court of Justice or in the European Parliament that might trigger that mechanism. Even if that doesn't happen, what military planners call the throw weight of countries like Poland and Hungary will be a little reduced in Brussels, particularly because they are seen by some Commission officials almost as pariah states, particularly Hungary. So that relationship with Europe remains a big question. Of course, there are other impacts coming from Brexit. Poland and Central Europe lost a member state that in many policy issues, particularly on competition policy and digital policy, was actually favourable to the Central Europeans. And without the Brits there in the Commission, it's going to be a tougher struggle for some Central European countries making their case on a number of areas of policy. And of course, we're all keen to see what the shift in power in Germany with Mrs. Merkel departing, Armin Laschet taking over, who's going to be the Chancellor, and how far he and also President Macron, who does have an election next year, is going to be playing the relationship with Central Europe. Will the Macron's plans, which he floated last year, of moving ahead on Eurozone integration and leaving many non-Eurozone countries like Poland outside of that orbit of decision making, will that return, or will he ease off in the name of broader EU unity?
Marek, obviously, change in the White House and Joe Biden becoming the president. How much will that influence things?
Biden's people in the foreign policy establishment critical of Poland and Hungary on rule of law issues, NGO issues, cultural issues. Will that impact the very warm bilateral relationship that was being built up under the Trump presidency? And in general, what will the Biden presidency mean in terms of refocusing the US much more on Brussels and on rebuilding that relationship with Berlin and Paris, rather than focusing on Central Europe, which is what President Trump was doing? So a lot of questions there. And of course, a lot of people looking to the United States to see what the impact of the Biden stimulus package will be. Very deep pockets indeed being found in the US Treasury. US new nominated US Treasury Secretary already saying that she'll be moving ahead with a further stimulus package, which is going to ramp up to 25% of GDP when you count all the Trump and Biden years together, which is in a way is sort of good news, because if America grows That's good for the American economy. It's also good for the global economy. And it's also good for the relationship with the EU. And very finally, Richard, obviously, everyone's saying, well, Biden's going to be good for rebuilding the US-European relationship. But there are issues like China, NATO spending, Russia, where he might find himself having some very tough conversations, particularly in Berlin, where particularly if Mr. Laschet takes over the chancellorship in the second half of the year, at the end of the year, where Germany and the United States don't necessarily see eye to eye. So a very complex picture, very uncertain picture, a very dynamic picture, especially for Central Europe.
And how do you see the 3Cs initiative, Marek? Do you think that that's going to become more influential, I guess, over the next year or so?
It's a long history behind it, or historically. A lot of sentiment involved in the region, but primarily driven by the recognition by the Central European leaders, meaning from the Baltics to the Balkans, a big swathe of Europe, that they're behind the curve in key investments, whether it's in energy, infrastructure, digital economy, and trying to find a mechanism through which those countries can work together to accelerate their development and investments in that area. Now, it always boils down to money. These countries individually on their own are fairly hamstrung in terms of deficit. Their freedom of maneuver on fiscal policy, monetary policy, relatively limited. Where's the money going to come from? And that's been one of the challenges for the 3Cs initiative. They have set up a regional fund, which is partly financed by state banks and state-controlled conglomerates in the region. But they're also looking for investments, particularly from the United States, and not averse either to the Middle East, perhaps even coming in as a funder. And I think that's one of going to be the great initiatives of the region. We wish them well. Obviously, under President Trump, yes, there was a great interest in the United States. A lot of people wondered whether that was driven by the interests of Central Europe, whether it was part of the Trumpian skepticism towards the EU and trying to undermine Brussels' influence in the region, whether that was a motivation. Could be. We ought to see with Biden. I mean, so far, a number of Biden's advisors spoken actually well of the project. They want to see it continue. But I think you will see it balanced with a greater engagement with the EU itself, and the real focus for the US administration being, ongoing negotiations on a potential EU-US free trade deal. If that's a long story. But I think that the priority of the 3Cs will perhaps lessen from the US government's perspective. But you will see local, regional governments in Central Europe, particularly wanting to move forward with it. There's already a next summit has been announced. It's going to be in Bulgaria, probably in the second half of this year, 21. And there will be a lot of interest in Central Europe in making that project work. They see it as it's the flagship project that they want to see happen and get Central Europe, back onto a level playing field in those crucial areas of infrastructure with West European countries. So the Central Europeans are not going to give up on the idea.
No, it'd be very interesting to see how that levelling up agenda comes through, particularly. Thanks very much for joining us, Marek.
Thank you very much, Richard.